Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murderer. This is Jeff Jones. With me is the panel, and we will start from the top and welcome Big Jeff back. How you doing there, Big Jeff?
Hey, Jeff, it's good to be back here for our continued marathon on episode 2. I'm really looking forward to it. It's always good to see that's been a little bit of movement in the case, and it's moving forward. Probably pretty soon we'll have to hear a decision from our good friend Judge Angie as to what she's going to do after she reads the state's response. So looking forward to that, and looking forward to further dissecting some of Ken Kratt's bullshit that's coming up.
Well, I won't stop you with that, Big Jeff. That's for sure. Jack, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Staying busy, and got some new FOIA material that been getting converted and getting put up in the library and so forth. But yeah, really looking forward to getting back into this, and as Big Jeff just said, looking forward to really dissecting more Ken Kratt's bullshit, because man, he's got it. So I'm ready.
And Kel, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back, and I'm here and ready to go.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Dr. Silkman, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jeff, and big hello to all the panel and everyone in chat. I really can't wait to rip into this episode.
You heard a suggestion already, in which will be evidence in this case, that the battery was disconnected on Ms. Halbach's vehicle. But importantly, in reaching up underneath the hood to open up Teresa Halbach's vehicle, Mr. Avery was kind enough to leave his DNA on the hood latch. DNA evidence, again, is not just from blood. It can be from skin cells, which are left through perspiration.
How condescending was Mr. Kratz? We want to thank Stephen for leaving his DNA, his sweat DNA, underneath the hood. It's rather remarkable. What he should be disgusted about is the mere fact that the crime lab never swabbed the hood latch back when they had the RAV4. And if it wasn't for the coerced confession, and I'm sure my other panel members will back me up on this, if it wasn't for the coerced confession of Brendan Dassey, the state wouldn't have known about the hood latch swab, right? They never would have done it. And it's remarkable that they waited 149 days after the fact. And look at Ken Kratz strutting around like a peacock as though they've made the biggest discovery in America. If it wasn't for the coerced confession of Brendan, the state wouldn't have known about the hood latch at all.
Well, I think that that Kathleen Zellner got it right in the last episode, because as my recollection is, they didn't even swab the battery cable. They didn't swab the little not lever that you have to pull on the inside of the car to release the hood. What they did happen to swab was the hood latch itself, which is where you have to reach your hand in, and that happened to be the place where they found the DNA. What a stroke of luck, according to Kathleen, as Kathleen put it so well. What a stroke of luck.
Yeah, it's truly remarkable when you think about it, because, guys, if you could remember what they asked Cherie Colhane during the trial, they asked her, well, look, how do you do a swab when you take a DNA sample? And remember what she said? She said, I look for a stain. I look for the presence of blood. I do a presumptive test. If the presumptive test is positive, I do another swab and then process for DNA. And it's remarkable that underneath the hood, they found no evidence of any blood, so no stains and no fingerprints or palm prints. So it's remarkable, guys, that all of a sudden the state finds Stephen Avery's DNA exclusively from the hood latch swab.
And we can't forget about Item FL.
Correct. two critical pieces of information, item FL and the hood latch swab, all came well after the fact, and that the crack CSI unit had missed both items.
So as long as the topic of the battery is on the table from this particular cut, and what I found very interesting about that picture of the battery, which was disconnected, was that both battery terminals were removed. Now I don't do a lot of work on cars, but I do know a little bit about electrical engineering since I am one. And I know that all you would have to do to make a car safe to touch and remove any possibility of any automated remote key fob system from working, all you'd have to do is remove the positive terminal. And anytime that I do anything on a car that would require disconnecting the battery, that's all I do is remove the positive terminal. That's the hot terminal. That's all you need to do. And I would think that an auto mechanic who is, or somebody familiar with cars, as the Averys well are, would also know that. So it would surprise me that someone with that level of familiarity with cars would actually remove both terminals. So I was curious if anybody either on the panel or in the chat had any, cognizance of working on cars. Well, that's typically what mechanics do. I mean, they're not electrical engineers, so they do that for full safety. But it's not necessary. So what is the real, protocol that you can expect a mechanic or somebody with familiarity with cars to perform?
I don't know of any reason why that car being in storage, why they would have to have both terminals unhooked from that battery. One's enough, as you said. I don't really know why they would do it. I really don't.
Yeah. So I guess maybe I'm making a mistake. I'm assuming that picture that we were shown was sort of an in situ picture, right? Meaning that the crime lab had not yet really done anything but open the hood and taken a picture of it. So I was led to believe by seeing that picture that is the way the person who planted the RAV or left it. And so I'm suggesting that the person who planted the RAV didn't really understand as much about cars as other people. That's sort of my speculation.
See, coming from someone who doesn't have any idea about cars and all that, my first impression of someone who is such a rookie, it appears to be someone like me who would do that, because I don't know that you'd have to just undo one. It depends on what, I guess, the whole objective of was to take it off in the first place. Was it to stop an alarm? Was it to prepare to remove it and then that person got distracted and had to leave the area? Or was it that the law enforcement went overboard because they were just trying to create a narrative that Stephen went under the hood, and then they undid both the battery cables just to tell a story? It's hard because we don't know obviously why someone even did it in the first place. There's so many alternatives, but for me who don't know cars, that would be something I would do.
I can't remember in testimony, I don't know if Jack can help me here. I don't know if they discussed either one or two battery terminals being disconnected from the RAV4 during the trial. I remember that they did mention battery terminals, but I can't remember whether one or two battery terminals were discussed, because the crime lab knew that the battery terminal was disconnected. The battery was disconnected because when they went inside the RAV4 to look at the odometer, there was no presence of lights. So, and plus they couldn't actually read the odometer. So they knew the battery terminal was disconnected. This is rather remarkable when you think about it, because no one had the foresight to think, hey, wait a minute, someone obviously went under the hood. So when they did check under the hood, no one had mentioned the presence of any blood stains. And I'm not even 100% sure whether they even looked for fingerprints. So it really was a very poor forensic investigation.
Yeah, well, I'll just add that on the last of course, I 100% agree with everything that was said. We know that they did not go under the hood at the Avery salvage yard, right? They couldn't get in the car, and the only way to get under the hood is to pop the latch inside the car. So you can't get under the hood without doing that. You can't disconnect the battery without doing that. So the first time that hood would have been open would have been into the crime lab. And so if that picture that we see is one that was snapped right away, then that means that was how the killer left it, which would mean both terminals were disconnected, because that's what you see very clearly in that picture.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, Big Jeff, whether those photographs were taken at a later time. I don't think they were. I don't believe that they were taken in the crime lab. They look to be like they've been taken outdoors, because you could tell by the sunlight that's hitting the bay of the hood, in the internal engine bay. I could be wrong, but those photographs could have been taken much later.
Things we know now that we didn't know then. This battery is the same type of battery that you put in a Crown Victoria, and that is a very common model for a mid-2000s police car. So it's very strange that this type of battery should end up in a Toyota RAV4 in the first place. So there's been a lot of speculation about that, and the fact that Teresa had all sorts of warranties on her car. How would she end up with a sort of a non-stock or non-Toyota battery? There's been a lot of speculation about that. I don't know if Zellner has anything about that in her hip pocket. The battery terminals are the two shiny bits. Maybe you can point to them, Jeff, on sort of the top of the battery. In between the green stickers in between the two terminals. And you can see that this battery has two special attachments, right? On a Crown Victoria, the battery terminal would fit right over those big fat prongs, and you'd have like a screw that would sort of wedge the battery leads onto those big fat terminals. And you can see that this battery has been specially outfitted sort of with its own adapter, so you can attach it properly to the Toyota leads, which you can see one of them is on the right-hand side, and it's got a red wire. It's got a red stripe on the wire. You can kind of see at the top of that wire where the terminal is up there, and that goes on top of that screw that's attached to the fat terminal and get screwed down. And on the other side is the same thing, and the red with the red stripe is the positive lead, and that one over there that obviously fits over there is the negative lead. So I can't quite read the metadata on that photo, which is on the right hand side. It looks like. Does it say when the picture is taken on that metadata?
Yeah, it's like September 5th, 2006. I think it is.
So that's pretty late into the game. So anything, like Dr. Silkman said, anything could have happened to that battery between now and then. But if this were a picture of how the person who planted the RAV left the car, I'd be very suspicious that it was actually somebody familiar with cars who did it. In my mind, the most obvious reason to do it is because you would be afraid, or if you were trying to hide the car, then you wouldn't necessarily want somebody who was going around with a key fob to be able to press the panic button and make the alarm go off. Now we know in hindsight that Teresa's car didn't have that feature, right? You had to use a key to get into her car. We know that from Henbury's research. But the killer probably didn't know that, and since all Teresa had was a valet key, then they might have been concerned that somebody might have been able to come around with a key fob, press the panic button, and I only have to be within half a mile of the darn thing before it starts going off. So in order to prevent anything from like that from happening, then you disconnect the battery. But there's no reason to, as we've said, to disconnect them both. You only need to disconnect the positive terminal to make all that all that hiding happen. So to me, it's the theory is off because we don't know. Of course, the crack team didn't take an in situ picture the first time they opened the hood of what the hood looked like. or what the battery looked like anyway. So we don't know whether or not this is the same state that the killer or the planter left it in. So that was
right.
what I was bringing up.
That's an excellent point, Big Jeff. And for we know, those bozos in the crime lab could have taken off one of the other battery terminal leads, right? So therefore, because it's not a true in situ photograph, you've really got no idea how that battery was found. And the proper way to have done it would have been to have opened the hood immediately, either at the salvage yard or the crime lab, and taken photographs, right? But it never entered their skull to have done a proper analysis underneath that hood. And you could tell because we've seen the coercion of Brendan. It was Fassbender that asked him, did your uncle go under the hood? Did your uncle go under the hood? And of course, what they're expecting Brendan to say was, yes, my uncle disconnected the battery terminals. But clearly, Brendan never said that.
Just put up that link I sent. This is the exhibit that was shown at trial, and they've cropped out the positive side. You notice that?
It looks like that battery wasn't really designed for this mount. These things get me going to wonder, maybe it's non-nefarious, but maybe it isn't.
The other thing I see, Jeff, I mean, if I'm looking at it closely, maybe you can zoom way into the battery, that mounting screw itself. Because what I see is a very round-looking, place where the dust isn't, and that to me would be what a deep socket ratchet wrench would leave, kind of round spot as you began to put it over that terminal to take it off. Right, it's going to be hard to get that off with a wrench because the wrench is going to get the high profile. The high profile of that mount is going to interfere with getting a wrench on that terminal. So you're going to have to use a socket wrench to be able to get that off. And that round place where there's no dust gives to me the appearance that a socket wrench had been used kind of recently, because it looks like it sort of ate into that pile of dust that was there. So and the other side seems a little bit cleaner. Right, that to me looks like an imprint from a socket wrench. So we're doing real time backseat investigating here.
In agreement with you there, Big Jeff. Yeah, I didn't expect to take a close look at that. Real quickly, Jack. My point was
that's a great catch.
Thank you. Just wanted to get this in here real quick. If you're going to if you know something happened with the battery, but you're not exactly sure, did someone replace the battery or did someone just take the the positive and negative off? You're going to want to inspect it closely. And if you have any suspicion that this battery was removed, why not test this bar? You have to put your hand on that black bar and pull up to get the battery out. So why not test all this stuff? Why not get, and I think it's a great one that you found there, Big Jeff. Just last comment, and then you guys can go ahead. Yeah. It really does look like a fresh socket spin right there. Or a washer, or an old washer,
But the biggest problem with this investigation, and we've discussed this many times, guys, and that is the moment they found the presence of Stephen Avery's DNA inside the RAV4 and on the hood latch, they really stopped investigating. That's all they wanted. And the state investigators never in their life would have ever thought that people like us and others years later will be asking some tough questions. And that's why Mr. Kratz, going back to the sweat DNA, that's why he really rode that to town. And that is, he mocked everyone by saying, what, now people are walking around with vials of Stephen Avery's sweat? And so the presence and him mentioning the sweat DNA really convinced a lot of people of Stephen's guilt.
It just goes to show you that you can find something. It's always worth looking at all this stuff, even if you've looked at it 1,000 times. Look at it again, show your friends. That there's always something to look at.
Sweat. Now remember, at trial they said it was sweat DNA. that was on the
Right. So
hood
that's
latch.
just
They locked into that.
that's just wishful thinking because you can't test for sweat. So the
Right.
answer is we don't know the source. That's the
Yeah.
honest, correct answer.
Right. What about touch DNA, touching and opening it?
The amount of material you're going to get from handled objects is pretty low. If you do it multiple times, you'll get more.
Right.
But these results were quite interesting when you compare them with what they found in this case.
We were curious to see what sort of results we might get from having this hood opened and the latch handled. So we had 3 volunteers, each do it 5 times. We had 15 tries, and I sampled the latch each time. I only got a detectable signal from 4 of those 15, and those were very low quantities, like, much less than even, half a nanogram total.
There's 2 important points here. One, the participants who tried to open up the hood latch and leave their touch DNA, you can see that only 4 times, I believe out of 15, actually left enough DNA sample that it could be extracted by the technician. So point number 1 is, if you're going to leave touch DNA, the amount of touch DNA that you leave is extremely small. What is highly, highly suspicious here is that Stephen Avery left I believe it was around about a 26-fold higher level than anybody else. Remember, they took the DNA sample 149 days after the fact, which means that that DNA sample was sitting on a metallic hood latch for 149 days. It would have been on metal. One thing for sure is that DNA over time degrades. And when you've got DNA on a dirty substance or dirty area like a hood latch, you've got things like bacteria, fungi, potential for enzymes, the environment, chemicals. All of those are involved in breaking down DNA. The mere factor that the lab technician, Cherie Cohen, was able to extract 1.8 nanograms or wherever it was, that's a huge amount of DNA. And what's even more disturbing is that there was no sign of blood, right? So if Stephen Avery was actively bleeding, for some unknown reason, he hadn't left any signs of blood, but he did leave a huge amount of his DNA. That doesn't make any sense at all.
So I would think, Dr. Silkman, also that there's a chance, right? Since it's where it was, that it would get wiped off, right? When you reach in there to grab the hood latch, there's only a limited amount of space that you can grab, and in order to swab that area, you had to open the hood again. We don't really know how many times that hood had been open, and all those chances to sort of wipe that off, none of them succeeded.
This is a big Jeff. This is another classic man miracle. When you consider that all the people that potentially could have opened up that hood latch and could have left their DNA, and what is remarkable, that the only person that they find again is just Stephen Avery. And I think Kathleen Zorner made the very important point. Wow. Isn't that miraculous? They needed another source of DNA to prove that Stephen did, in actual fact, go in the car, i.e. left his blood, and went under the hood to disconnect the battery. And so you've got this another miraculous finding whereby nobody else had touched that hood latch, and Stephen conveniently left a huge amount of DNA on that hood latch.
I think it's hard to understand how small a nanogram is. And so if I wanted to describe how small a nanogram was, I would say if you take a gram, right, for people in the United States, maybe gram's not familiar, there's 455 grams in 1 pound. So take a pound, cut it into 455 pieces, and you have a gram. And then take that gram and cut it into 1 billion pieces. And then take one of those pieces and cut it into 1,000 pieces, and that's a nanogram. So that's pretty small. So that's a tiny piece. And what we're saying is that swab, which is the size of a Q-tip, ran up and down the wrap, only managed to collect this amount of tissue on the order of 24 nanograms for Stephen Avery, or what it was 25 times. But it was run all over the place, and every time somebody touched it, when multiple people touched it, they left this tiny piece, but somehow we only managed to collect it from Stephen Avery, despite the number of people over the lifetime of that car who had touched it. Just amazing. It's miraculous. So yeah, I agree. Maybe miracle number 3.
It's not just the fact that the results came out so astonishing and high. It's the fact that there was a time lapse between it as well.
Because not only that, guys, but what you have to believe here is that Stephen, through touch DNA, not sweat DNA, touch DNA, had left a much higher amount of DNA than the scientific subjects that actually tried it. And if you notice, only 4 out of 15 goes actually left any amount of DNA at all. So there were 11 attempts that left no DNA at all, no detectable DNA. And Stephen, after 149 days, left 1.8 nanograms. Now, a nanogram is an extremely small amount. But guess what, guys? It's enough for you to do a PCR reaction. Isn't that remarkable that Culhane just happened to extract enough DNA, enough genomic DNA to do a PCR extraction and get his full, robust genomic DNA profile? Now, guys, let's think about it. He left his DNA on metal, a surface that is dirty with grease, oil, and everything else. In other words, when you leave DNA on an external environment, scientists have shown that over time, the DNA degrades rapidly, which means that if you look at that 1.8 nanograms, you need to multiply by several factors in order to get the original amount of DNA he actually left if they were testing it in situ.
So my question there, Dr. Silkman, is should this experiment been repeated the same amount of days it took for the crime lab to get to it?
So what I would have done, I would have done this exact experiment, then did it again and came back 149 days later, re-swabbed it and re-extracted the genomic DNA, right? And just see if any DNA could be found at all. But this is embarrassing, guys. This goes to show that a person leaving a fresh sample of DNA, they were leaving behind 0.05 nanograms up to 0.09 nanograms in situ. And yet, Stephen Avery, after 149 days, Sharika Culhane was able to extract 1.85 nanograms after 149 days. And I joked around once in one of our podcasts, Stephen Avery must have left his fingertip on the hood latch to get that amount of DNA. It is insane.
Can you go through and explain to the panel and the chat how we can eliminate what could have been the source of it? So blood versus touch versus saliva versus sweat versus like so forth. So we know it's probably not blood because there was no presumptive test. There was no visible blood. So can you explain that? Because I think a lot of people also say that they get really confused with, okay, then if it wasn't blood, if it wasn't saliva, what was it?
Sure. Well, the thing is that later on in the episode, Dr. Reich actually has tested the hood latch swab. So he's got a series of tests where he can actually check for the presence of specific protein markers. So there are protein markers in saliva, there are protein markers in blood, there are protein markers in semen, and there are protein markers in urine. So hence, you can actually determine the presence or absence of those markers in the sample. So as Kelly alluded to, you can determine the origin of that swab, right? Where it at the source of the DNA. And I'll tell you right now, guys, a bit of a spoiler, it's not from a buccal swab, right? So there was no salivary amylase. There was obviously no presence of blood. And I don't think there was any presence of urine, and I don't think they tested for semen. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. That means that there's one potential, and I think you guys know where I'm going with this. It's from skin cells. And we know because we're doing Reading with the Crew episode at the moment. Stephen Avery, when he was arrested, the nurse actually took 2 groin swabs. Those groin swabs will actually have epithelial cells, right? And epithelial cells is exactly the type of result that you would get here. That type of DNA, not urine, not blood, not saliva, obviously not semen, but a groin swab would definitely leave skin cells behind. There is no test for sweat. The actual average DNA that was left by the people touching the hood latch was 0.072 nanograms. And Stephen left around 1.85 nanograms, which is about nearly 26-fold higher than what everybody else had left, right? Now, unfortunately, to a jury and a judge, they're not going to understand the significance of that result because, as guilters would say, and as people in the jury would say, hey, that's his DNA. Okay, he left a huge amount of DNA. Yeah, okay, even after 149 days, but it's still his DNA. So trying to convince a jury and a judge that, Your Honor, that DNA result is extremely suspicious when you consider that the average that people left in an experiment was nearly 26-fold lower, right? Now, your argument is if he is such a good shedder, guys, back me up. Why isn't his DNA all over the RAV4 if he's a good shedder, right? Stephen would have had to have opened the doors to get in and close the doors to get out. You don't find his DNA on any of the doorknobs, right? But you find Teresa's touch DNA on the inner door handle on the driver's side. The whole thing doesn't make any sense, guys.
I think a statistician would look at that and tell us that typically if you could begin to establish sort of a mean and a variance of these other samples, it's really the deviation of that other measurement from the average, the average of the other measurements, which you call the standard deviation, right? That is many standard deviations away from the mean, and any statistician would throw that out as a statistical anomaly.
It's a massive outlier. A massive outlier.
It's a rich source of DNA, whatever is on that hood latch.
Right.
It's not touch DNA.
Blood and saliva, very common forensic sources, lots of DNA in them. Lots and lots of DNA in there.
Okay, so they fought the idea that that was blood on the hood latch.
That contains a swab from the hood latch of Teresa Hallbach's RAV4?
Yes.
Do you recall when you looked at the swab, did you notice any condition to it as far as color?
It was discolored, but it did not have the appearance. It was not a reddish-brown discoloration consistent with blood.
So it did not appear to have blood on the swab?
Correct.
That's a huge red flag right there. Because during the trial, they'd asked Culhane, all right, tell me, how do you get a sample ready for a DNA prep? And she said, what we do is we look for a stain, right? So they go around the RAV4 looking for the presence of a stain. They then do a swab and they do a presumptive test. So basically, if they see a reddish brown stain, they take a swab and they do a phenolphthalein test to determine the presence of blood. So if there's blood present, there's obviously means that there's going to be white blood cells present in that sample. So if it is presumptive positive for blood, Culhane then does another swab in order to extract genomic DNA, right? And that's how she does her PCR reactions. Now tell me, guys, she just admitted in court that when she looked at the swab, there was no discoloration in terms of blood, right? So hence, it's rather remarkable that it was processed for DNA. And lo and behold, despite the fact that they normally look for blood and a stain, there was none of that on that hood latch. And yet she extracts Stephen's and only Stephen's genomic DNA from the hood latch, which is exactly what she did for the key. No presence of blood on that key, yet she still swabbed it and only Stephen's DNA came up. I reckon that's another man miracle there, Big Jeff.
It sure is, Doc. It sure is.
In the Avery case, there are a number of DNA profiles that were obtained that make you wonder what was the source. They're pretty robust, they're full profiles, but they didn't do body fluid identification. So where did it come from?
So what source, right, of the
What's the source
what's
of the DNA?
the source of the DNA?
In order to determine the source of the DNA, laboratories have 4 tests they can run. One for blood, one for saliva, one for semen, and one for urine. Blood, that should show up. Semen isn't an issue on this. Urine doesn't count either. Right. So you're left with one other test.
And it would be the saliva.
Of course. Our laboratory has developed a test for saliva that's very widely used.
And if I am able with that test to detect saliva on the hood latch,
well, then you're starting to build a different story. Now you're building the story that Mr. Avery is spreading his saliva all over the place, or someone else is taking
he's licking hood latches.
An innocent explanation or a not so innocent explanation.
Right.
And in any event, it contradicts their original concept of how it got there.
It really profiles like a buccal swab of saliva, and it would be very improbable, I think, that you wouldn't have had a mixture. To me, it looks like a surface that was cleaned off with diluted bleach, and then the buccal swab planted the saliva, because you just got Stephen on there. You don't have anybody else who ever opened up the car. And then, of course, there's a hood release inside the car. That's never swabbed for anything. The prop that holds the hood up, nobody ever swabs that. So see, that's all things the defense could have requested that they didn't. So I don't know if they were talking to a forensic scientist, but a forensic scientist would have immediately told them that.
If his hand was there, why didn't you find fingerprints?
Well, they're looking for DNA. That's what was looked for, and that's what they found.
So that you're saying they didn't look for fingerprints?
I don't know.
You know, sorry to stop it on such a beautiful image here, but that's what they were looking for. That's what they found. Like, if it hasn't been more telling of some questionable police work, well, that's what they were looking for. So that's what they found. It's like, if you rewind way back to 1985, Big Jeff, or that case, and they say, why are we going after Stephen Avery? Because he fits the profile. Not because we think he did it, but because he fits the profile. And here's Ken Kratz. This is what they're looking for. This is what they found.
All I've got to say is one word, and I'll fire up Jack 61. Jean Couché. Right, Jack 61? Jean Couché.
The pencil.
The pencil. The guys, all jokes aside, Mr. Kratz knows the power of DNA. He's no dummy, right? And so the jury and the judge will understand, they get it in their heads, that if DNA is found somewhere, especially at a crime scene, it means you were there. And it's very hard for you to explain away what your DNA is doing there. Kratz knew that. So what Dr. Reich is getting at here is saying that, well, potentially results can be manipulated to give the impression that you were there. Kratz understood that if he could find two sources of DNA on that RAV, it's going to convince a judge, it's going to convince a jury. So Stephen not only left his blood in the RAV, which by itself, and I agree with Kelly, it's very hard to explain. It is hard to explain. But now he has left his touch DNA underneath the hood, which is a different source to blood, right? So now can you see that what the state are doing is building up a picture that Stephen was actually there. But the crime scene doesn't fit. It doesn't work out. Because if Stephen is leaving his blood, if Stephen is leaving his touch DNA, where else is it? And why aren't there any fingerprints belonging to Stephen or Brendan on or in the RAV? It doesn't make any sense, guys.
I would imagine this would be a pretty important thing to know. You're alleging that he drove this vehicle and hit it. I would imagine his fingerprints would be all over the thing.
They might have. I don't have the case file.
You know, these DAs are just doing whatever they want to do. Trying to make fit what ain't true. The DA's got too much power for anything and everything. You know, they're supposed to protect the families, you know, the citizens. They got to be accountable for their actions. We got to change it. This can't happen to somebody else.
I'm sorry to stop it, guys, but this is my folksy sayings number 478 by Stephen Avery. He is preaching the truth here, my friends. DAs have too much power. They're supposed to protect the citizen. We got to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else. Truth bomb again. Thank you, Stephen.
He should be in here. Where are you? Put him in here and me out there.
So as you understand, Stephen, we're doing brain fingerprinting testing here, and that detects concealed information in your brain.
I learned about testing that many authorities think is superior to polygraph, which is brain fingerprinting.
How often have we heard these words from law enforcement officials? These are details known only to the perpetrators. The latest technology in forensic science uses those details to prove a suspect's guilt or innocence. Developed by Harvard-trained Dr. Lawrence Farwell, brain fingerprinting uses brain waves to measure what Dr. Farwell calls the aha of recognition.
Farwell says that when the human brain recognizes important information, it triggers a specific electrical signal called a murmur that can be measured and analyzed.
I told Stephen the CIA, the Navy, the FBI was using the very sophisticated test to detect if someone was telling the truth or not about being innocent, and would he do the test. Regardless of whether it would come into court or not, I convinced Stephen Avery that it was 100% reliable, and that if he flunked it, we would have a big problem. So I laid all this on him. So he very enthusiastically agreed to subject himself to this testing. He was thrilled that there was something like that we could use.
The whole thing was a setup by Kathleen Zellner to say, hey, look, this test has been used by the CIA. And by the way, they actually have used brain fingerprinting. But it was a bluff to really see whether Stephen would take the bait and involve himself in that test. Because if he really had committed this murder, there's, according to the brain fingerprinting method, you can't hide it. Your brain will actually provide the answer that the investigator is looking for. You can't disguise it. It comes up as a peak during that when they take the measurements. So Stephen took a big risk by being involved, if you know what I mean. So it was a really cleverly designed bluff by Kathleen Zellner. Yes, you couldn't admit it in a court of law, but Stephen never had to take the test. But if you notice, he was more than willing to have a go, which I think says a lot.
Oh, I agree, Dr. Silkman. It definitely says a lot. And I think, again, it was a big bluff for Kathleen. It was more reassurance for her that she was, you know, on the right track for representing Stephen Avery. But I do see a flip side to it. And being the fact that I do like to bring a balance, I don't think it changes everything in an overall picture, because we have had people like Chris Watts voluntarily openly go, yep, I'll do a lie detector, but there is killers that have confidently inserted themselves into testing and they've been guilty and they thought that they could get away with it. So agree that it absolutely, you know, this is a new one, it's a unique one, and that Stephen was enthusiastic because he obviously had nothing to hide. But it mirrors the fact that there is people out there that are convicted, that are guilty, that also submitted themselves to these testing because they thought they could beat it. So you've got to balance that out as well. It's a fair comparison to make. It doesn't completely make them truthful, and it doesn't completely make them innocent. It just reflects on their character a little bit more.
Yep, 100% agree, Kelly. But what is impressive is that Stephen didn't show any reticence in doing the test. He happily volunteered. And remember when Kathleen Zellner said to him, look, when we do all these forensic tests, the state are going to get all the results, right? We can't control that. And he goes, yep, test whatever you want.
So let's go over some things that you know and some things that you couldn't possibly know if you really haven't done the crime. Okay. The Stephen Avery case was very challenging for brain fingerprinting. If we had gotten there on day one, the perpetrator would have known everything about the crime. An innocent suspect would know nothing about the crime, and we'd have a wealth of evidence that we could test. Stephen Avery has been through a long trial. He knows a tremendous amount about the crime from the trial. So we had to find information that was not presented at the trial, or even information where what they thought happened at the time of the trial was not accurate.
It is consistent with a bloody object such as a body being loaded into the rear end of this vehicle.
When we did the blood spatter analysis and realized that the prosecution had made a big mistake about the blood spatter on the rear cargo door, we used the blood spatter pattern, what it actually indicated, to test Stephen Avery's knowledge about that cargo door being open and where Teresa Halbach was positioned at that point. We wanted to know, was he storing that information of hitting her, knocking her to the ground, and then repeatedly hitting her in the head? Because if he was, he'd be the killer, because that's how the blood ended up on the rear inside cargo door.
We present three different types of stimuli. Things we know he knows, things that are irrelevant, where we won't get the response, and then probes where we'll get the response only if he knows it.
We spent 2 days there. We did 13 hours of testing on Stephen.
When we analyze the data, we can make a mathematical determination. Yes, this information is stored in the brain. No, the information is not stored in the brain. So you've got no response to the irrelevant things. You've got this big response you can see in the red line to the things you know. Now, the question we were asking scientifically is, do you know those details about the crime that nobody ever told you, but the person who did it definitely knows? See this blue line? Mm-hmm. Now, that blue line doesn't show that recognition response, does it? It looks just like the green line. It's basically a flat line. So what that means is, according to your brain, you don't know what happened when she was murdered. If you had been the perpetrator, this blue line would have had, the red line. Yeah, it would be just like the red line. It would have that big response in it. So this is very powerful evidence that, in fact, you're innocent of the crime.
I knew that already.
I love that bit that he's looking at him like, you've just wasted your time and you wasted mine, but it's good that we kind of worked that out. The only thing that I have, because I did do a bit of research on this since, Kathleen has used this testing, it is relatively new and it's interesting. The thing is, and I get it, like, it's a structure, so it triggers the mind. You're presented with words and images, and if your mind reacts to it, they say you can't control it and your brain will react and it'll spike. The problem is, like the state, Kathleen said, they got it wrong with the blood spatter at the back of the RAV. We know that it wasn't from a body, it was from an object. But that's like the specific really detail that you have to capture. And like this test, it kind of has the same disadvantage. You almost have to know the really detailed things to trigger the brain. So basically, if you're off by the object itself, you might not get a trigger because it wasn't a golf club, it was a hammer. So that's the few little like tweaks that I've kind of read, that they're saying that it has to be so accurate that the details and what you're trying to achieve is exactly the narrative, because you've got to insert that to be able to be presented. So that's a little thing that I find interesting, because let's just say theoretically, we know Stephen didn't do it, but let's say that they did find the actual killer and they put him in front of this, and let's say he doesn't trigger to a bloody object. Now, the side effect could be they showed him a golf club, a hammer, a gun, and there's no reaction. But that might be because they missed out the crowbar, for example. The crowbar wasn't put in that picture imagery and his brain there didn't react. So that makes him pass because he didn't react. So little things like that, I think, although it's a very, very awesome new technology that I rate, because I think it's quite interesting, but there seems to be a few little twerks that need to be made.
I agree, and I think that one point is what the doctor had pointed out. He had said, the longer that this case goes on, the more information that the subject of this test knows about the crime, the harder this test gets, because there's less and less for us to. And they used the example of getting hit behind the RAV4, and a lot of us tend to believe that that's a plausible scenario, but nobody really knows, and so therefore they could be asking him a question of something that didn't actually happen. And that's where we find flaws in these tests. The opposition could say, well, you don't actually know. You're assuming that, and then you're asking a question based on this assumption. And so that's where I think things start to get a little gray.
What would be very interesting would be to get the doctor's questions, the questions that he actually put forward to Stephen, because as Kathleen Zellner said, they were there for a long period of time. So I would dare say that the mentioning of the back door didn't trigger a response. And I agree with Kelly. It could have been a different object that was utilized in hitting Teresa Halbach. So hence Stephen or someone who was guilty may not have reacted if that particular object hadn't been stated. But I bet you that Stephen didn't react to backdoor. And that's the crucial thing, because the back door of the RAV4 was clearly open when Teresa likely was bludgeoned with some type of object, right? So I don't know if Jack 61 wants to mention that search warrant that mentions the blunt, bloody object that was found in the back of the RAV.
It carries so much weight because it was was unfiled. The search warrant was unfiled. It was still part of a sworn affidavit by Wiegert on the 7th of November. So I think it holds a great deal of water. I don't know, it just boggles my mind. And it changes the nature, even though we can't see it because, again, it's not there. But you can visualize something in your mind because we thought for long up until, 6 months ago when Sunshine Christina got these unfiled warrants, this was not a thought that there was some piece of evidence in that RAV that had disappeared, but now we have it.
You see, I didn't know that, but now I know it, and anybody who understands the science is going to know it as well. So what does that mean to you?
It's good news.
Stephen has all the hallmarks of someone who's innocent. How cooperative he is, the lengths that he wants us to go to. There's nothing about him that I think is indicative of someone who's guilty. I'd bet my life on Stephen Avery being innocent. I'm positive he's innocent. The question is, can we prove it?
This is excellent. This is an excellent result. I really didn't know until today.
Now we got to find out who did.
Wow, was that a really strong statement from Kathleen Zellner? I'd bet my life on it. I know for a fact that Stephen Avery is innocent. It's just, can we prove it? And I think that's where we come to a point where we're all in the same boat at this point, and anybody can pipe up in on this, but that's where we are at. I think all of us on the panel think he's innocent. I don't want to speak for you guys, but I think we're with KZ. And I think it's like, can you prove it? And that's the question that I would pose to you guys. Can this be proven?
That's a good question. I think that when you say can it be proven, you go into court, and in the United States anyway, you are either guilty or not guilty, right? So not guilty is sort of a little bit non-definitive. To me, this case is not so much about being able to prove innocence so much as it is about reasonable doubt. Sufficient reasonable doubt exists in my mind that this trial was a sham. There was evidence planted. There was a gigantic motivation from 1985. I don't think he did it. I don't think anybody's ever going to be able to prove it. I'm not sure what prove means. I know what it means in the mathematical sense. I don't know what it means here. The real killer is long gone. We're not going to find a video of the real killer. Prove, I don't know. Sufficient reasonable doubt, more than enough in my mind that he at least deserves a new trial, and I believe he'll be found not guilty in that new trial.
I have to agree with everything Big Jeff just said. I think that to maybe prove is a very strong word right now, but I think that this case has always had the elements to be solved. I honestly believe that the answer was probably always there. It was just the factor of it was overlooked because that wasn't the objective and the narrative that they needed. They wanted and needed Stephen. So I think, the true killer made a lot of mistakes. And in making those mistakes, they left their, I'm going to use the word fingerprints, but they left their signature all over this crime. Unfortunately, for some reason, we know the reason, the blood in the RAV, whether it was, regardless who planted it, it was directed to go to Stephen and only Stephen at the end. So I don't know if it'll ever be, we'll be able to, well, the courts or Kathleen will actually be able to prove who actually did it. But I agree with Big Jeff by saying that at best, and what we kind of only need now is reasonable doubt in the court of law. And I think that would set Stephen free. Ultimately, as well, it will be up to the prosecutors to then reopen the case and then press charges to anyone else they seem fit.
Add a little bit more to what Big Jeff said and what Cal said, looking at, and what we just talked about was the unfiled search warrant and this blunt and bloody instrument that just disappeared. So it was reported, but then somehow it didn't make it any further in any other official reports. So are there other pieces of documentation that we don't have, that things were reported, just as I was talking about, that we've never seen? I suspect there is. I can't prove it till I get my hands on it, but I suspect there is. Also, this is something that I've been doing lately, and that's studying what other key things did the investigators do. And, you know, you can look no, I mean, I dare say you can look no further than Jody's case. And how many times they went after her, not to get forensic evidence. They went after her for other reasons entirely that really had not a damn thing to do with the case. She wasn't even there on October 31st in that time frame. She was locked up. So I look at these other things the investigators did during the course of the investigation, and that in a sense tells its own story. Plus, they listened to every single call that he made, and probably every single call that Brendan made as well. But
I mean, for me, I mean, I like to focus on the forensic evidence, as you guys know. I think if we can explain the blood, the presence of the blood inside the RAV4, that's going to go a long way in order to solve this case. I agree with Kelly. Whoever planted the blood left a specific message, and all fingers were pointed to one person and one person only, and that was Stephen Avery. That's the story that is here, that is present here. I do believe that there is plenty of reasonable doubt, and as a lot of researchers have shown, there's no doubt that there's a lot of tunnel vision here, specifically pointing a finger at Stephen, and as Kelly has alluded many times, at what particular point in the investigation did that occur. I believe it occurred fairly quickly. One of the biggest problems I see in this case is very, very sloppy forensic and crime scene investigation. Basically, the investigation stopped when they got Stephen's genomic DNA found, the blood that was found in the RAV4, and also the key. That these were very important elements that initially were detected. After the coercion of Brendan Dassey, you have the hood latch swab. You also have item FL. So basically, the investigators put a bow on the case and try to make it as watertight as possible. In my belief, there's definitely plenty of reasonable doubt.
Well, with that said, Dr. Silkman, I think we'll have to leave it there for next week. And that means it's time for Big Jeff's wrap-up comments. So if you wouldn't take away, you have the floor, Big Jeff.
Well, I'll do it very quickly because we didn't really get a lot of the episode done, but it was a tremendous dialogue by the panel. And I always appreciate, especially Dr. Silkman's expertise on the forensic evidence. But in summary, isn't it ironic that when Ken Kratz complained about all the things that Making a Murderer left out, he complained about the hood latch swab? And, for the past, hour and 20 minutes, the panel has just gone to, in my mind, with the great help of Dr. Silkman, to completely eviscerate that evidence. There's way too much of it there. especially for how long that it was there. And it's really just silly. It was found as part of Brendan's coerced confession, which means there's a high probability that it was planted. I would say it's obviously planted. And so, the one thing that Ken Kratz latches onto, the hood latch law, that's what Ma'am didn't show. It's just yet more of his bullshit. The more you dig in, the more reasonable doubt you uncover, the easier it is to comprehend the coercion of the confession and the framing of Stephen Avery.
Thank you, Big Jeff, for those comments. Jack, a lot said today. What's your takeaway?
Well, it's hard to add really too much more to what Big just said. This whole thing about the forensics, this was a really good episode that really showcased a lot. The brain fingerprinting, which, and when we heard about this stuff, I was like, what the hell? I'd never heard of it before. But apparently it is a thing, I don't know if it's been allowed into court in the U.S. or not. I think it has, but I don't know. But regardless of the fact, if it's repeatable and it's a doable thing, I'm all for it. But the forensics themselves, Dr. Silkman, Big Jeff, Cal, they've all talked about the all of it, the whole thing, and it's just, I don't know. I'm a little more crass about it, I guess. It's just crap to me. It's just garbage. They only found Stephen's DNA, only, and to me, it's just not possible. If there were in that car on the daily, and I dare say she had her friends in the car, whoever that may be. I'm not talking about anybody specific, but we know that her friend Kelly was in the car, Kelly Pitskin, and I would imagine others as well. The hood latch DNA, they only found his, so Stevens is the only person that ever went into the hood of that car. The battery terminal, the battery itself, was a great observation by Big Jeff again of that battery and post being disconnected, which was unnecessary. Of course, now that photo is almost a year later. Still, it's unfortunate we don't have an in situ photo, but even at that, the crime lab. I mean, that whole thing that happened on November 5th when they found the car and they didn't pop the hood, they didn't open it up, so they knew exactly what they had before it was ever moved anywhere. It's another real tell for me. I have a real problem with it. Always have.
Silkman, I appreciate you walking us through a couple of these things today, and if you wouldn't give us your wrap-up comments.
Oh, look, for sure. And I just want to say how grateful I am being on the panel. And obviously getting a lot of good questions in chat. It's really fantastic. I mean, I'm only a small part of the panel, and I'm glad that I can help with the DNA aspects of it. That's really what attracted me to this case. The forensics do not make any sense at all. The DNA information from this case makes no sense at all. And it's really great that Kathleen Zellner had invested her time in getting experts to look at the forensic evidence again. And I think we can slowly start to see the unraveling of the state's case. I cannot wait for the next episode. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman. And Kel, if you wouldn't wrap it up for us a little bit and tell us your takeaway from today's episode.
Yeah, it's amazing as always to be part of this panel. It's great to see people interact in the chat. It's the questions are awesome. It keeps us all thinking. And yeah, in terms of this episode itself, I think that it's on to the next. Like we cover, although sometimes we don't make much ground in the actual documentary, but we cover a lot of ground in just the case itself. So yeah, thanks for always having us back and everyone supporting Brendan and Stephen. We're here for the same reason, and that's to fight for their freedom.
Absolutely, Kel, we are. I appreciate those comments from you. And just my own personal comment for my wrap up is that this time around, I understood that KZ was using the brain fingerprinting as maybe a tool to bolster her own confidence in Stephen Avery's innocence. And we saw that demonstrated with her passionate statement saying, I would put my life on it. And so that's all for today, guys. I appreciate everybody in the live chat. I appreciate everybody who's been commenting and sharing on your social media. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's the best and easiest and cheapest way to support the channel. And so for Big Jeff, Jack, Kelly, and Dr. Silkman, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.